Okay. So, are you recording?
Yeah, I just did it.
Okay. Okay, so we've arrived at the ideal of pure reason, which, as I kept saying, is the most difficult part of the transcendental dialectic. But I think, just on the ride here, I figured out for the first time how it actually works. So I don't know, we'll see. Okay, so let me just begin by reminding you again where we are in the text here, right? So we had, because it's going to be relevant. So we had the analytic and the dialectic, right? These are the two main parts of the transcendental logic. And so the analytic is supposed to be about how the pure understanding is fine as long as it stays within the bounds of experience. Right? That is, against Hume, it shows that we're justified in thinking that we have these concepts that we can apply a priori within the bounds of experience. And the dialectic is supposed to be about how reason or something, remember I got all worried about this before, but anyway, something knocks the understanding off its course. Something about the nature of our cognitive faculties itself tends to knock it off course and get it to try to apply its categories outside the bounds of experience where it's not legitimate. The way I explain that in general, well, let me see. So there's supposed to be three versions of that corresponding to the three types of syllogism. And so the way I explained that in general was by trying to explain what kind of unity reason supplies in the syllogism that the understanding doesn't supply, and therefore what kind of unity it's demanding, which then, by an illusion, seems like it requires this transcendent application of the categories. Right? Remember that as opposed to what we were talking about in the phenomena and noumena section in the amphiboly, where Kant says that the error there involves the transcendental employment of the categories, meaning that I'm using them for things in general without worrying about whether they're empirical or not. Right? So like transcendental, this is a little bit misleading, but you can think of it this way, that transcendental includes empirical and transcendent. The reason it's a little bit misleading is transcendental means that you ignore the distinction between empirical and transcendent altogether, right? You abstract from the fact that there is such a distinction, and you just think about things without worrying what intuition they're given by. But in any case, when you go back and don't abstract from that distinction, then you have to distinguish things into empirical, that is given by sensible intuition, and transcendent, that is not possibly given by sensible intuition. So what happens in the dialectic is that because of this illusion arising from the demands of reason, the understanding tries to make a transcendent employment of the categories, that it tries to employ them specifically about things that could never be given in experience. Okay, and again, I want to summarize, because the reason I want to summarize this again now is because understanding how this works in the case of the disjunctive syllogism is really hard, and that's part of what makes the dialectic hard. I mean, the ideal hard. So, okay, so the way I explained it, a syllogism gives unity to, or maybe start from the other end. A judgment involves the unity of many possible cognitions. And in the simplest case, and it seems like maybe Kant thinks that the conclusion of a syllogism is always this case. And I'm not sure about that. But in any case, the simplest case is the universal affirmative categorical judgment. And the way it unites many possible cognitions in one is that we have the subject concept and the predicate concept. And the subject concept supplies unity to some synthesis. So that is, it enables us to think many possible experiences under one principle that's in us. And the same unity is what allows, in a judgment, us to think those same things all together under the predicate. So if this judgment is all cinnabar is red, the many cognitions that are united into one are cinnabar here is red, cinnabar here is red, cinnabar here is red, cinnabar here is red. I mean, I'm avoiding saying this cinnabar because that makes it sound like it's a singular, that these are singular judgments, whereas they're not. They're just applications of the category to different parts of the object, so to speak. And actually not just so to speak, because what the amphiboly shows is that really the condition of doing this is space. So it really is the different places in cinnabar that are being united here, but leaving that aside. All right, so that's the unity of the understanding. The unity of the understanding connects all these together in order to think them under one predicate in a judgment. The unity of reason takes those same cognitions, for example, you know, the cinnabar is red here, cinnabar is red here, and connects them all together by giving a unified explanation for them. So, so the way I drew this before is kind of from the outside, we have one explanation or ground. Right? Because the understanding in asserting this judgment doesn't say why you can think all these things together under red. It just takes them all together and, so to speak, notes that it can think them all together under this predicate concept. But reason wants to know why that is. And reason answers that kind of question in its logical employment in a syllogism by finding some higher condition which explains why all of these things fall under which explains why everything that meets this condition is going to fall under this one. So, for example, if we have a categorical syllogism, all A is C, but all C is, no, all B is what? All C is B, but all A is C. Therefore, all A is B. So if this is like, if A is scholars and B is mortal, so here's the judgment that understanding is asserting. All scholars are mortal. Reason is going to explain why all scholars are mortal by pointing out that all scholars are human. That's the higher condition. Because all scholars are human, that's why they're all mortal. And because this is a categorical syllogism, the type of explanation it's looking for is one that's internal to the object of the subject concept. Right? So the object of the subject concept is scholars, and it's internal to scholars, not to the concept scholar, but it's internal to scholars that they're human. And it's more internal, right? It's more essential to them that they're human than that they're scholars. So that's the sense in which it's a higher condition, more internal. That's in the case of a categorical syllogism. And so reason demands that if I reasonably assert this judgment, I must be prepared to give an explanation for it, and an explanation for the explanation, and so on and so forth. Where an explanation for the explanation means specifically the minor premise, right? That is, I want to explain I'm saying that all scholars are mortal because they're all human, but, well, see, now I keep thinking, going back and forth about this. Is the minor or the major premise? I think it's the minor premise. All right, so what we want to say is something that's even more internal about them that explains why they're human. Until we get to the occult substantial form. Something like that. And then when we talked about the paralogisms, I explained why somehow that turns from a general demand for occult substantial form everywhere into a special demand that I understand the innermost substantial nature of my own self as a thinking thing. Right? That I know exactly what a res cogitans is, and I can derive all its properties from that knowledge. All right, so again, reason, in that sense, reason demands that if the condition is given, that the whole series of conditions must be given. I have an explanation for why it meets the condition of this, because it meets the condition of this, because blah, 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 blah. And whether that's finite or infinite, if it's finite, it has to end with an unconditioned condition. And if it's infinite, we have to take it all together, but one way or the other, reason demands that the completion of that. And that far, that is, as a logical, that is subjective principle, right? A logical principle is a subjective principle because it's about the form of cognition. That is, it's about the formal reality of cognitions, their nature as determinations of the subject. As far as that goes, Kant thinks it's right. Reason is right to demand that. But what that means as a subjective demand is just that whenever I assert something, if I have to realize I'm responsible for explaining it. If I can't explain it, then I realize that if I reject the demand that I explain it, then I'm asserting it irrationally. But the illusion comes from turning that subjective demand into an objective demand. That is, we say something in the object of the concept A, the object and its connection, as he puts it, must ensure that that series is always present. So corresponding to the three different types of explanation that can be given, reason looks for three different types of unconditional ways of thinking the object and its connection. And that has to be transcendent. That is, in the case of the categorical syllogism, where it's talking about the object of some empirical concept A, but now it has to be considering it not as given in experience, but as a thing in itself. Whereas in the other two, it's easier to understand because we're actually talking about two different things. One is empirical, and the other is being regarded as not given in experience. But one way or the other, the thing that when we're thinking the thing as unconditioned, we're thinking it as transcendent, because experience is always conditioned. And remember, I tried to explain why experience is always conditioned in terms of what a sensible intuition is. Sensible intuition means that I don't have sufficient principle in me to from which to derive that exactly these experiences have to happen. So I can always only say anything about it on the condition that I actually had some experience or other. All right, so that again is supposed to be the general structure of the dialectic. Now, so again, in the paralogisms, we're looking for an absolute internal condition. And I guess, by the way, since something about the object of every empirical concept, no matter what it is, has to guarantee this, it has to be somehow guaranteed based on the transcendental conception of the object. That is, the object thought just through the categories. Right? That is, it can't, the unconditioned, it can't be something about cinnabar that guarantees this. Something about the empirical properties of cinnabar. In fact, it can't even be, and this is going to be important in the ideal, something, the things we know a posteriori about matter in general. For example, that it's impenetrable, which for Kant means relatively impenetrable. That is, he thinks that matter is defined by the fact that that to get farther into it, you have to push harder. Not that there's an absolute limit that you can't go beyond. But anyway, so I don't think you could tell that from this book, but that's what he says in the Metaphysics of Natural Science book. It can't even be that a posteriori knowledge about matter in general that guarantees this, because that would mean that we wouldn't be guaranteed a priori that for an object of any empirical concept we could do that. After all, we can't explain a priori why matter, that is the object of our actual empirical experience in general, is impenetrable. We only know it from the fact that we experience it. So it has to be based on a description of the object by the pure categories that we can find this. So, right, so what I was saying when I stopped to say that was that, so in the paralogisms, we're looking for something like an absolute internal condition of the object described by the categories in general. Now, then I explained why that turns into the object described by these subjective quasi-categories, right? That is the convertible transcendentals. But I'm not going to go back into that again. So that's the paralogisms. In the antinomies, we ask for an unconditioned external explanation of every object thought through the categories in general. And in that case, it turns into really using those objective categories. We think of the object as a substance with a certain quality and quantity. And then we ask for an unconditioned explanation external to every such object. And that turns out to be a contradiction. That's why it's the antinomies, right? Because you can't ask for a condition that is part of the empirical world and yet is external to every empirical object. Okay, so what's going on in the ideal? First, other questions about what I said so far? Like, besides, what the hell are you talking about? All right. Seriously, is there anything I can say to make that clearer? Because I know it's pretty abstract, but yeah.
Do you mind just clarifying again the type of unity that reason? I know it's the same manifold of cognitions that it's unifying, but what is it that, so reason demands an explanation?
Demands a single explanation for it, right? So again, so if I want to ask, so when I assert all scholars are mortal, now this is a weird example. I preferred all cinnabar is red for a lot of reasons, but all scholars are mortal is the syllogism Kant actually discusses. And in the case of all cinnabar is red, I'm not sure what the higher condition is, or what Kant thinks it is. Right? Like when I discuss this, I start talking about mercury sulfide and whatever, but as you can see from the scattered mentions of chemistry that Kant makes, that the chemistry he's dealing with is not like ours. So I don't know. Anyway, let's take all scholars are mortal. So when I assert all scholars are mortal, the idea is that I have this concept scholar. Already this is weird, but okay. I have this concept scholar which brings unity to a certain synthesis of experience. I can think of it all as scholar. One of the things that's weird is that unlike cinnabar, scholar is a discrete quantity, right? That is, it's not continuous. You can't add like half a scholar or 3/4 of a scholar, you know. But, and it's really because of a teleological principle that comes from somewhere else, I think, because a scholar is an organized being, unlike Cinnabar. But all right, forget about that. Imagine that scholar is kind of like this stuff, right? And so I'm thinking of it under this concept, and this concept brings unity to it. And when I assert all scholar, let's say all scholar is mortal, in this way, as if we're a mass noun, when I assert all scholar is mortal, all I'm saying is that once I gather all that experience of scholar together into this one principle, I find that I can apply another principle to all of it, namely mortal. What reason wants to supply is a reason, right? As I pointed out before, that pun doesn't work in German, because in German, the faculty of reason is called Vernunft, and a reason is Grund, ground, right? But in Latin, they're both called ratio. I think that's what Kant is thinking, right? So reason supplies as a reason, right? That is, it asks, how does it come to be that everything that could be thought into this principle can also be thought into this principle? And if it can find one reason that applies to all of them, then it's given a new kind of unity to all these cognitions. Right? Before, it could have just well been by accident, so to speak. Right? This part of scholar was mortal for this reason, and this part of scholar was mortal for some other reason. Understanding doesn't care about that. But if reason can find one explanation that unites all of these, then it's supplied a higher kind of unity, as Kant says, to the exact same cognitions. All right, that was a good question. Yes.
A certain amount of scholar that has to be accumulated before you can form a higher concept of it?
You mean in terms of like how we actually form empirical concepts and learn things about empirical objects?
Well, in order to, like, if you have different, like, a scholar is something for one reason and then a scholar is something for another reason, in order to unite it for that higher faculty, do you have to, like, I mean, what if you only have 3 instances of scholar? Do you have, like, better things?
So, I mean, empirical knowledge is inductive, right? So, yeah, you need, I mean, I don't think there's a fixed quantity, right? But also by the same token, you never get certainty about these empirical judgments, right? It could, you know, there's some scholars who are alive now. We think they're going to die like all the others, but we have to wait and see, right? So, I mean, we think we can explain why they will die like all the others, but we still have to wait and see, right? So, yeah, to learn anything about any empirical object requires a certain amount of experience of it, and even to form a concept of it, right? That is, the experience of it precedes the concept. So if scholar were really an empirical concept of natural science, which, again, is weird because it isn't, right? But if scholar were really an empirical concept of natural science, like Cinnabar, then the way we got the concept Cinnabar was by experiencing Cinnabar over and over. And first the imagination developed a schema, right? Came to associate certain properties with each other in such a way that it was usable by the understanding to form a concept. And the transcendental deduction is the only thing that guarantees that that will ever happen. But the transcendental deduction does guarantee that it will happen. Although it doesn't say how easy or hard it will be. This is something he talks about, again, when he talks about teleology in the third critique. That is, that there's something to nature that goes beyond just what's guaranteed by the deduction. That it seems fitted for our faculties. That it doesn't take forever to form any empirical concept. All right. That was another good question. Is there any other good questions? Bad questions? A question from our studio audience. All right. All right. Okay. So that's the general explanation of how the dialectic is supposed to work. Now, and I said, so in the paralogisms, we're looking for an absolute internal condition. Antinomy is an absolute external condition. What are we looking for in the ideal? So to explain that, I have to say something more again about what a disjunctive judgment is supposed to do, and therefore what kind of ground is the reason is looking for in a disjunctive syllogism. Because remember, right, and then, as I said, it seems like, at least in the examples Kant gives, and he may or may not think this is always true, but that the conclusion of the syllogism is categorical, right? The way they're different from each other is whether the major premise is categorical, hypothetical, or disjunctive. So, so we want to understand what it means that the major premise is disjunctive, what kind of explanation that means reason is given. And the way I explained this was something like this, so it's a kind of combination of hypothetical and categorical. Now, it's not a combination in the sense that you can write a bunch of categorical and hypothetical judgments with logical connectives or something like that and get a disjunctive one. That's, I mean, Kant and traditional logicians in general just don't even think about putting judgments together with arbitrary connectives. except in the special case of forming a hypothetical or a disjunctive judgment. But it's a combination in the sense that it asserts that the conditions internal to the object of some concept are sufficient to determine the possible range of external conditions. And the concept whose internal conditions we're talking about might not occur in the judgment itself. In general, it won't. But it's there in the background, so to speak. Like the example I gave of this before, which is not an ideal example for, no pun intended, for various reasons, but so I said either all mercury is toxic or toxicity sometimes follows merely from its compounding into a sulfide, right? I mean, that's a crazy example, but the point is, so I'm saying, right, so you have to know that mercury sulfide is toxic. Mercury sulfide, cinnabar is one of the forms of mercury sulfide. That's why I'm using that example, right? Mercury sulfide is toxic, and what I say in that disjunctive judgment is either mercury is always toxic, or mercury becomes toxic specifically when it's combined with a sulfide, when it's sulfided. You say in chemistry. All right, so, sulfidized. Right. So, so what's in the background of that is the concept mercury sulfide, but it doesn't occur in the judgment. So the concept mercury sulfide contains the object of the concept mercury sulfide. So here's the concept mercury sulfide. And it has a certain object. Internal to this object is some condition which makes mercury sulfide all be toxic. We don't know what it is, let's say. if we wanted to know what it is, we would be asking for a categorical explanation of the judgment, all mercury sulfide is toxic. But that's not what we're doing here. In the disjunctive judgment, we're saying you can divide all toxic mercury sulfide up into two parts. The part that's toxic, or maybe I should draw this in the object, actually. So to speak, there's the part that's toxic just because of mercury. And there's the part that's toxic from the addition of the sulfide. Now, when I say there's these two parts, I don't mean that that's why I'm not sure where to draw this line. Maybe it should be here. The point is, I'm not dividing the like bulk of mercury sulfide in the world, right? I'm dividing the sphere of the concept, mercury sulfide. And actually, presumably, one of these parts is empty. That is, at least if the categorical explanation succeeds, there's going to be one reason why all mercury sulfide is toxic. Right? Otherwise, it will turn out that it's all toxic just by accident, so to speak. Some of it's toxic because mercury is toxic. Some of it, whatever. So, I mean, one of these things is going to be not contain any bulk of mercury sulfide in the real world. But nevertheless, I can divide it into these two parts, and I can think of these two parts as conforming to the rule of this concept under the influence of different external conditions. Now, by external, I mean external to this concept. Right? So one condition is mercury is toxic. Under the influence of this condition, we get this part of the sphere, the part where mercury sulfide is toxic because of this. Under the influence of this other condition, adding sulfide to mercury makes it toxic. We get this part of the sphere. It can't be divided by something that's internal to the object of this concept as such, right? Because this sphere is the sphere of all things that meet whatever conditions are internal to the object of that concept as such. So it has to be divided by conditions that are external to this concept. And what I do in a disjunctive judgment is say, the sum total of possible external conditions has to add up to this internal one. Right? In every part of this sphere, there must be some external reason that mercury sulfide is toxic. Either this one or that. Maybe there's other possible ones, but let's say there's just those two. And that's how I make the disjunctive judgment, either this or that. That's the unity the understanding is asserting when it says either this or that. It's saying, now, again, the judgment doesn't actually mention this, right? But when the understanding says either this or that, it means there's some internal condition in the object in general, that is in the world, so to speak, right? Somewhere, there's some internal condition which is exhausted by either this or that. Which, when you add up this and that, you get all of it. Yeah?
The external conditions are produced by the unity of understanding, and that judgment is made by reason?
Well, I'm still talking about the judgment here. Reason hasn't come in yet. This is why, as I said, one reason the ideal is the hardest part is because the disjunctive judgment is really complicated, and therefore the disjunctive syllogism is even more complicated, and therefore the dialectical inference here is really, really complicated. Right? So this is just the way the disjunctive judgment works. Just in asserting either this or this, the understanding is asserting that this plus this adds up to the sum total of possibilities in the object under consideration, whatever it is. And I don't say what it is, but there has to be one in the background, because otherwise, what does this have to do with that? Right? There has to be some synthesis that is being unified in this way. And that synthesis is the object here of the concept mercury sulfide. Oh boy, and I realized, so we're going till 2, right? Okay. Okay, so in a disjunctive syllogism, then I'm trying to give this kind of explanation for a categorical judgment. Right? That is, I'm trying to say, why is it that, and why is it means here not for what cause, but how can I prove? Right? What's the explanation for the fact that all sulfide is toxic, let's say. Or that, sorry, yeah, how could I prove that all mercury is toxic? No, suppose mercury wasn't toxic. I'm trying to really good example of this. I don't like this example at all, but anyway, suppose, all right, so suppose we find that mercury sometimes is not toxic. So that would be the basis of a disjunctive syllogism. This is how it would go. I would say either all mercury is toxic, or adding sulfide to it makes it toxic. But it's not the case that all mercury is toxic. That would be the minor premise. Therefore, it must be the case that adding sulfide to it makes it toxic. That's how the syllogism would go. Right? And so in that syllogism, the conclusion, adding sulfide to mercury makes it toxic, is all those cognitions of mercury added to sulfide being toxic are given a kind of reason. And the reason is that the reason is that there can't possibly be a cognition of something violating this rule because all the other alternatives in the common ground of possibility have been exhausted. So again, here the common ground of possibility is off the scene somewhere, right? It's the object of the concept mercury sulfide. It's off the scene somewhere, but I'm saying, but the explanation I'm giving in the disjunctive syllogisms somehow brings it in, right? Because I'm saying that given that this alternative has been ruled out, we must be in this part of it, and therefore this must be true. And that unites all those possible cognitions of mercury becoming toxic when you add sulfide to it. That's the way the syllogism would work. Of course, this is wrong, right? It's really true that mercury is toxic, and that's why mercury sulfide is toxic, but never mind. All right. So, so this is really confusing because there's actually 3 different, not counting this unity in the concept, forget that. There's actually 3 different unities involved here, right? There's the unity of the understanding in making this judgment, in asserting this judgment. There's the unity of reason in explaining this judgment, which again means taking all the possible cognitions that make up this judgment, so to speak, and giving them one explanation. But there's another unity, which is that the unity of all these different judgments in the one possible ground of possibility. That's not directly involved in the syllogism, but the syllogism uses it as its explanation, right? So the unity of this common ground of possibility is what enables reason to supply its kind of unity to this judgment. Other questions about that? I mean, I hope by now you can kind of see how this is going to translate into transcendental theology, vaguely speaking. There's a kind of unity of a ground of possibility which is off the scene of the empirical world, but which is being brought in to explain the empirical world as an alternative among all possible worlds. Okay, so in particular, what the ideal is going to represent, the ideal wants to represent in the object, right? That is, it's, again, Kant thinks this is right as a subjective demand. As a subjective demand, it's right that I should require that in the end, everything can be seen as different alternatives of the same basic possibility. And if I haven't done that yet, I haven't finished explaining why I'm allowed to assert the judgment. Right, so he says, this is, I don't think this was in the reading, it might not be in the assigned reading at all. I think it's in the regulative employment of the ideas, where he talks about the step that was made in chemistry when it was shown that salts have only two basic types, acid and alkali. Okay, again, this doesn't really make sense in terms of what we think those words mean, but that was the way people talked about chemistry at that time. There's two types of salt, acid and alkali, and the point was that the advance chemistry had made there was to show that that there's one nature salt that only has these two alternative forms. And until you understand that, saying something like all acids are blah, blah, blah is not fully explained. Okay, so the subjective demand Kant thinks is right. It's subjective demand for systematicity of our empirical knowledge or something like that. But the objective demand is, reason says, there must be something, the transcendental idea of an object, which guarantees that there's always an unconditional explanation of this type. That is the unity in any judgment we can assert has to be derived from some common, absolute common ground of possibility that, so to speak, is the sum of the possibility of all of them. Right? So now, it's as if there's a huge disjunctive. Right? We're going to either assert this, or this, or this, or this, or this, or this, or this, any possible judgment. There's got to be one ground of which those are all the limited alternatives. So it could be this one, or this one, or this one, or this one, all the infinitely many possible judgments. And in fact, part of the illusion here is we can't even think the totality of all possible judgments, right? Once we start thinking of judgment in this transcendental way, we don't know what we're talking about. But we think, yeah, all possible judgments have to be divisions within this one total sphere of possibility. Just in the way this judgment and this judgment were divisions within the sphere of the concept mercury sulfide. So, that representation of the absolutely total sum of possibility is the ideal. Or anyway, it's the idea of reason in this part of the dialectic. It's which gives rise to the ideal. Not sure which way to put it. I think you could, well, I mean, all right, you'll see why I'm confused about it when I say a little bit more about this. And so notice that as with the other ideas, we've taken a step into the transcendent. And the way it works in this case is that although we started off, let's say, with empirical judgments and their empirical alternatives, when we asked for a complete ground of possibility for all judgments, then we're asking for a ground of possibility that doesn't have any empirical conditions attached to it. And that's not something that could ever be given in experience, right? That is, it can't be that we'll discover, let's say, that everything in the world is mercury sulfide or everything is water, as they were supposed to have said, right? And that explains that all the possible alternatives are just the different ways that the world can be made out of water. Or that discovery wouldn't show that water is the object of the ideal, I guess maybe is the right way to put it. Even if we did make that discovery, which in a sense Kant thinks we have made and we make right away, namely that everything in the world is impenetrability, right? Everything in the world is matter. But that doesn't make matter into the object of the ideal, because once you start asking for an absolutely unconditioned ground of possibility, you're comparing all the conditions of the empirical world to every other possible judgment that could be. Which seems, at least negatively, brings in other judgments. Right? That is, at least negatively, I can say, I can contemplate the judgment, some substances are immaterial. Just by negating the fact that the empirical rule that they're all matter. And now the common ground of possibility has to catch those two. Therefore, the common ground of possibility is not the subject of any empirical concept like water or mercury sulfide. And therefore, when we think of it, we're making a transcendent employment of the categories. Okay, so far I think this is relatively straightforward. I guess relatively is the key word there. The question, and I mean, this is a question which, this is like the type of question that always bothers me, and but I think it's a good question to be bothered by. How exactly is this supposed to fit into the pattern that we saw established in the first two parts of the dialectic? That is, for example, where is the sophistical or dialectical inference of reason here? Right? I mean, I just said in general, based on the way the dialectic is supposed to work, I explained why the object here is this. But in the other two sections, he didn't stop with that. He gave an actual syllogism, which had something about the object of the idea as its conclusion. Seemingly just in saying this, okay, I have an idea that represents the sum total of all possibility. Number one, I don't have a conclusion of a syllogism, right, on a par with every thinking thing is simple, or something like that. Or the world has a finite extent in space. I just said I have some idea. It would be as if I stopped in the paralogism and said I have some idea of an absolute internal condition. That's not enough to get transcendental psychology or rational psychology. Similarly here, if I say I have some idea of the sum total of all possibility, that's not enough to get transcendental theology. So to figure out how we get to transcendental theology, we have to identify or anyway, it would help to start by identifying the dialectical syllogism here. I mean, the reason I say it would help is because even in those cases when we had the syllogism in front of us, it wasn't 100% clear why. As I just said, it's not clear why the paralogisms don't lead to the general concept of occult substantial form rather than to the rational psychology. I tried to explain that. But anyway, it certainly helps to have this, at least have the syllogism there, to see why the soul is the thing that's supposed to satisfy this. And there isn't anything, I guess, and there's one other thing. If I just have that idea, it's not clear why this should be called an ideal. And the reason I say that is because Kant defines an ideal in a very specific way. He says that an ideal is an idea which specifies exactly one object. It fully determines it. Right? It says exactly what object that is. So if two things are both objects of the same ideal, they have to be the same thing, because they don't differ in any respect. He's actually going to use that fact in his criticism of the cosmological argument for the existence of God coming up, that the objects that if you say every object of the ideal is so-and-so, if you say every so-and-so is an object of the ideal, then since there's only one object of the ideal, you can turn it around and say every object of the ideal is so-and-so. Well, never mind. We'll get to that next time, or tomorrow, actually. So there isn't anything that really obviously looks like a dialectical inference, a formal syllogism here. We expect it to be a disjunctive syllogism. Now, I say we expect that because, as I've pointed out several times, although I'm confused about why this is true, but it is definitely true that in the paralogisms, the dialectical syllogisms are categorical. And in the antinomies, the dialectical syllogisms are hypothetical. Right? Remember, in the paralogism, he gives, well, in the B edition, just one example, but he gives very prominently an example of a paralogism as a categorical syllogism. In the case of the antinomies, in the arguments for the thesis and the antithesis, he doesn't really put them in that way, but at some point in the critical solution or somewhere, he says, the whole dialectical procedure of reason in these antinomies can be reduced to, and then he gives a hypothetical syllogism which says, if the condition is given, then the series of conditions are given. But the object of experience is conditioned. I guess if something is conditioned, then there is something unconditioned. But the object of experience is conditioned, therefore there is something unconditioned. Something like that. I forget exactly how he puts it, but that's a hypothetical syllogism. So we expect here something that looks like a disjunctive syllogism. And furthermore, we expect there to be a sophisma figurae dictionis, that is a fallacy of equivocation somewhere in the syllogism between the major premise and the minor premise. We also expect one column of the categories to be used in thinking the object of the ideal. And so we expect the ideal to be divided into 4 parts, each one corresponding to one of those categories, right? That is just as in the paralogisms and the antinomies, we have that. Again, the ideal is not divided that way. There's just one long argument. Now, it's true, afterwards, he gives only three possible speculative arguments for the existence of God. Those, I think, I'm going to try to explain actually in a moment, why those arguments are not actually part of the ideal, properly speaking. They're attached to it, but the transcendental illusion of the ideal, properly speaking, doesn't lead to the conclusion that God exists. It only leads to the conclusion that we have a concept of God from which we can derive all possibilities. All right, so those three parts, whatever they come from, are not directly relevant here. So this is another reason, and this one seems kind of stylistic or something, as opposed to structural, why the ideal is the hardest part of the dialectic. I see people are kind of zoning out. This would be a time to take a break if we were going the whole hour and 45 minutes. But we're only... Well, I guess I should ask, do people need to leave at 2? Can we? All right, well then why don't we, if you can stay till 2:15 anyway, assuming no one else is coming into this room afterwards, which we don't know actually. But yeah, we should probably take at least a short break now, because I think people are enough. You can turn off the camera, or we could have a halftime show. I guess I'm not going to do that. I might, last time I gave a lecture like this, I had some kind of picture of, I had some kind of video of Alana.
Yeah,
like
one hobby.
Moving around on the ground.
Yeah.
I just put it in okay, so what I was leading up to is what I was leading up to was a couple of things. So number one, there's a kind of stylistic reason this section is difficult. It seems to me, especially now that I'm starting to feel like I understand it better, like you could have made it clearer and more parallel to the other sections. So it's possible, I know I suggested this before about the amphiboly, but there's actually some kind of intentional obscurity here. I don't really know how to explain that in this case, but you can imagine that there might well be reasons for it when we're talking about theology. That for some reason he doesn't want to make this section as easy to understand as the other sections. But that's all I can say about that. In any case, whatever the reason, I don't think it's because there is no parallel to the other sections. So, I mean, there's a couple of candidates here for things that look like disjunctive syllogisms. One of them And I'm going to start with the wrong answer, I think. And then go to what I think is the right answer. Partly because the wrong answer sounds better. It sounds more like a disjunctive syllogism. So here it is. This is on page 496. It's the last paragraph on B612. If we admit something as existing, no matter what this something may be, we also admit that there is something which exists necessarily. So far, notice that's a hypothetical syllogism. That's not a disjunctive syllogism, right? If something exists, then something exists necessarily. Or anyway, that's a hypothetical judgment. For the contingent exists only under the condition of some other contingent existence as its cause, and from this again we must yet infer yet another cause until we are brought to a cause which is not contingent and which is therefore... Oh wait, I'm not reading the right part here. I meant to read farther down on page 496. We're going to come back to that in a second. All right, this is actually further down on page 496, near the end of the first paragraph on B613. If then, in removing everything which is not compatible with this necessity, only one existence remains, this existence must be the absolutely necessary being, whether or not its necessity be comprehensible, that is to say, deducible from its concept alone. Right? That sounds like a disjunctive syllogism. The disjunctive syllogism in this case would be either the necessary being is this or that or this or that or this or that or this or that, etc., or the object of the ideal. But the necessary being is not any of those other things, therefore the necessary being is the object of the ideal. Right? That's the way that disjunctive syllogism that he's sketching out there is supposed to work. The reason I think that's not the disjunctive syllogism that characterizes the dialectical inference of reason in the ideal is because of the part that I jumped ahead of myself and read just a second ago. It requires, it's based on the premise that some being exists necessarily. But the premise that some being exists necessarily is the thesis of the fourth antinomy. That is, it doesn't come from the ideal at all. And you can see that he is referring back to the fourth antinomy from the fact that it's a hypothetical syllogism. If we admit something as existing, no matter what this something may be, we must also admit that there is something which exists necessarily. And then you have to fill in implicitly the minor premise, but something exists. Therefore, something exists necessarily. Right? So I think this happens in this section. So this happens in section 3, which is subtitled "The Arguments of Speculative Reason in Proof of the Existence of a Supreme Being." Right? This is kind of the introduction to the part where then he'll discuss the impossibility of all the proofs. He says there's only 3 possible proofs of the existence of God, speculative proofs of the existence of God. He's going to show that all of them are no good. And this section is the introduction to that. And this is why I think that, or I guess I should say, he says this explicitly even, but I think this is the clearest indication that I understand correctly what he's saying there, namely that once we go on to the proof of the existence of God, we're not just basing ourselves on the ideal, but we're mixing the ideal with the thesis of the fourth antinomy. Right, and that's why he says at the beginning of section 3, notwithstanding this pressing need of reason to presuppose something that may afford the understanding a sufficient foundation for the complete determination of its concepts, it is yet much too easily conscious of the ideal and merely fictitious character of such a presupposition to allow itself on this ground alone to be persuaded that a mere creature of its own thought is a real being, were it not that it is impelled from another direction to seek a resting place in the regress from the condition which is given to the unconditioned. Right? So I think what he's saying there is the conclusion of the ideal, properly speaking, is not the existence of God, but just the possibility of God, so to speak, that we have the concept of God. the fact that we go on beyond that and say, and by the way, such a being actually exists, is because from another direction, namely from the fourth antinomy, we're impelled to look around for a concept that's adequate to the idea of an absolutely necessary being. And we think we find it in the ideal. And this means that, so to speak, the fundamental speculative rational proof of the existence of God is what Kant's going to call the cosmological argument. Namely, the argument that says something contingent exists, therefore there must be an absolutely necessary existent, but Kant thinks that a further mistake comes in here, which is what he's talking about here, and what could that be? It must be God. Right, and there's really two mistakes in that cosmological argument. Actually, Kant says that it's a nest of dialectical errors. And reason seems to have pulled out all the stops to include every possible dialectical error. But the two most important ones are the mistake in the fourth antinomy of the thesis version of the fourth antinomy of thinking that I can conclude the existence of an absolutely necessary being. And the further mistake of thinking I can identify that with the object of the ideal. Even if the thesis of the fourth antinomy were right, there would be no reason why, and this parallels, this is an argument that one of Hume's characters makes in the Dialogues of Natural Religion. And I think Kant thinks that argument, and most of the arguments in that book, are absolutely right. Namely, that there's no reason that the necessary being couldn't be matter. There's no reason that this couldn't be the necessary being. Why? We have no idea what would make something a necessary being. Right? So, okay, so anyway, that's all by way of saying, although that is a disjunctive syllogism, I don't think it's the one that's essential to the ideal as such. So here's the candidate that I have instead. And it's on page 489, near the bottom of B601. So that paragraph starts like this. Although this idea of the sum total of all possibility, insofar as it serves as the condition of the complete determination of each and everything. So far we're just talking about that idea of a sum of all possibility, right? Something which would take the role of mercury sulfide here, but for every possibility. Saying, although this idea of the sum total of all possibility, insofar as it serves as the condition of the complete determination of each and everything, is itself undetermined in respect of the predicates which might constitute it. Right? I mean, this is supposed to explain why it has to be either this or this or this or this. We don't say anything about what it is. And it's thought by us as being nothing more than the sum total of all possible predicates. Right? But it's the sum total of all possible predicates in the sense that they all add up to this, the same way these two things add up to this. We yet find on closer scrutiny that this idea as a primordial concept excludes a number of predicates which as derivative are already given through other predicates or which are incompatible with others, and that it does indeed define itself as a concept that is completely determinate a priori. It thus becomes the concept of an individual object. So that's a disjunctive syllogism. Right? The disjunctive syllogism is, it's very vaguely contained in there, right? But the disjunctive syllogism has the form of the object of this idea must be one of the possible combinations of predicates. It must be determined by one of the possible combinations of predicates. But it can't be any of them except this one. Therefore, it's this one, right? And this one is the one he's saying that it thus becomes the concept of an individual object which is completely determined through the mere idea. So what is this one? Well, this one is what Kant calls the ens realissimum, right? The most real being. Ens means being. I hope that was clear when you were reading this. Ens means being, right? So ens realissimum means the most real being. And so I think more specifically, the dialectical syllogism is supposed to look like this. So call the object of the idea I. And here's the disjunctive major premise. And you can write it kind of like this. Right? This is the way we think we have got a kind of concept of that totality of all possible combinations of predicates. In the paragraphs after what I was just reading, Kant goes on to talk about how, transcendentally speaking, we have to think of every predicate as either affirming a being in its object or as negating it. Right, as either reality or negation. That is, that's why reality and negation are moments of a transcendental concept of quality. The object of every empirical concept must be representable as a reality and as a negation. Okay, so we think, okay, so we can lay them out like this. And what I did here is kind of have a reverse binary thing, right? Because we can't start from the end; it's infinitely long. So start from the beginning. It's like an infinitely long binary number, and this is where it starts. Right? And we can list all the ones with plus representing reality and minus representing negation, that is absence of reality. And we can list all of them until, at the end, quote unquote, of this infinite series, we get to the one that's all positive. And then we say, but I is not limited. The object of this ideal is not limited. Why? Well, it's supposed to explain all possible limitations of anything are supposed to add up to it. Therefore, I is plus, 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 plus. That is the ens realissimum. All right, so that's the dialectical syllogism, I think. And where is the fallacy of equivocation in it? I think the fallacy of equivocation is this, that, first of all, I guess, as you might expect, now, okay, a couple of things. Number one, as we saw in the other parts, this dialectical syllogism is not the syllogism by which reason is going to explain empirical judgments. Right? Remember, what reason is looking for is an absolute ground for the series of syllogisms that explain empirical judgments. But the dialectical inferences of reason are not themselves those syllogisms, right? This doesn't lead to an empirical judgment. The way that's supposed to work is once you know what this is, then you can plug it in at the beginning, so to speak, of the series, right, and use it to derive an empirical judgment. it's easiest to understand, although misleadingly easy, in the case of the antinomies, right? Like if you conclude dialectically, that is invalidly, that there is a first time that contains world, right? That there's a beginning of the world, then you can work forward from that to any time that you happen to be at. But the inference that there is not part of that series. It goes in a different direction. It's just one step, right? So, okay, so similarly here, this is not the inference by which we're going to use the ens realissimum to explain the empirical world. It goes in a different direction. It's just one step. So in the inference that we're going to use to explain the empirical world, I is like off-scene, right? That it's the sum total of all possibilities. That inference is going to be something like, well, the world is either this or this or this or this or this, but it's not any of those, therefore it's this. And off-scene is going to be the sum total of all possibilities that licenses the disjunctive major premise. But in this one, there's also a concept or something that's off the scene, and that's what the fallacy of equivocation is. So again, that's why it's particularly difficult here, because you can't point, I think, to any of the things that are actually mentioned in the syllogism and say that's where the equivocation is. The equivocation is what kind of totality of possible limitations we have in mind. And here, the major premise is true if we're thinking of the totality of possible empirical limitations of the empirical world. But the minor premise tries to abstract from that and think of the totality of all possible limitations. And so it's not a valid syllogism. So this makes it similar to the fallacy in the paralogism as opposed to the fallacy in the antinomies. Remember I mentioned before that antinomies is actually the minor premise that's empirical and the major premise is transcendental, is what he says. Right? The minor premise in the antinomies is, but the object of experience is conditioned. And that is in all its forms, but the object of experience is limited in quantity, is divisible, is an effect, and is contingent. All right, so, but here we're back to the pattern of the paralogisms, I think. Okay. All right, I already said that. And I already said that too. Great. Since I only realized what I wanted to say and then drive over, my notes are a little bit disorganized. Okay, so, well, this is also something I kind of already said, but I'm going to emphasize it a little bit more. So this ens realissimum, that is that greater than which nothing can be thought, is the object of transcendental theology. That is, this is how you would describe God using transcendental predicates. So in that sense, the ideal per se is about transcendental theology. That is, the conclusion of the ideal is that well, It's what forms the premise of Descartes' argument in the third meditation, which not surprising because the third meditation is a version of the cosmological proof. Right? So I have in me the idea of a perfect being that is the sum of all reality. But it's not, so to speak, theistic theology. Because so far we have no reason to think that something corresponds objectively to that idea. I mean, this is supposed to show that the idea, not just that the idea contains no contradiction, but that it's an objectively real idea, right? But an objectively real idea doesn't have to have an actual object. It just has to be, at least as Kant uses the term, has to be capable of taking an object, right? So in the case of empirical concepts, it's true. The reason we know that they're capable of taking an object is because they have an actual object, right? That is, as I was explaining before, it's the schema that comes first. So first we experience the object, then we form the concept. And so if you ask, how do I know that your idea is legitimate? I give you the empirical deduction, that is, I say how I acquired the idea from experience. But in the case of a pure idea like this, an inferred concept, right? Remember, Kant says the beginning of the dialectic, the concept of reason are inferred concepts. If you ask me, how do you know that your idea is legitimate? I tell you this inference. And this inference shows that the concept of an ens realissimum is a valid concept. But it doesn't show that something corresponds to it in reality. Right, and so I already said that to get from this kind of theology to theistic theology, right? That is from this idea that's in me of something infinite that I can touch but cannot grasp in my thought, as Descartes puts it, to, and there actually is such a thing. Something corresponds to that idea. Kant says I need to make a further error that's going to come in from the, well, I mean, one of two things. Either I have to realize that the real grounds here are practical and give the moral proof of the existence of God, which Kant thinks is the right proof. And then that's going to, in ways he kind of gestures at, kind of back this up. But only for practical purposes, right? As it won't throw the conclusion that God exists is theoretically valid, only that it's practically valid. Or another error has to come in from some other mistake of theoretical reason, and that's what happens in the cosmological proof, according to Kant. And I guess I'll just say, by the way, here that that I think, you know, this way of breaking it down into here we have theology, and then after you have theology in this sense, you have to ask, and what about, so does it exist? And where you find that this part is already, this part is harder and in some sense more questionable than the second part. I think it's a way of getting across something that I always try to tell people, which is that in some sense atheism is just as difficult a philosophical problem as theism or belief in God, because the hard part is common to both of them. The hard part is to try to figure out what the hell we're even asking for when we ask whether God exists. And do we have any concept that's suitable for that at all? And I think Kant is right to class this together with other things, named specifically freedom and I guess also immortality, where it's similar, right? That is, people can start arguing, as Kant says, the common understanding loves to do this. Let's all just start bullshitting about whether we have free will or not, right? People like nothing more than that. But by doing that, they've skipped the hard part, which is to ask, hold on a second, what are we even asking for here? Does this make any sense? what you're asking whether we have or not. All right, so that's just kind of an aside. So the other question that at least I'm left with here is, all right, so where do the categories turn up? And is it okay if I go on for another 15 minutes, even though it was announced for, okay. So, because again, in the other two parts of the dialectic, we saw, and we thought we understood why reason doesn't apply directly to any object. So it's going to have to turn to the understanding to think the object of its idea. And the understanding is going to have to use the pure categories to think it, because obviously no empirical concept or even schematized category is going to be, or mathematical concept or anything like that is going to be usable. So, and in the other parts, that was very clearly laid out, and there also seemed to be a pattern to it. And this is the thing that has really tripped me up every time I try to understand the ideal before, which I feel like I'm starting to get a real handle on. So, because the pattern seemed to be, now, I mean, this wasn't 100% clear, I must admit, but the pattern seemed to be basically that in the paralogisms, we use the first column, in my version of the table, the first column of categories. That is unity, reality, substance, and possibility. Now, it's true that here we had simplicity rather than reality, and I tried to explain that. And then in the antinomies, we're really using the second column of categories. Namely, plurality, negation, cause and effect, and existence. So, I've always thought to myself, shouldn't we expect the third column of categories here? So the third column of categories would be totality. That sounds kind of good for theology, totality. Limitation, communitas, commercium or community, and necessity. Necessity and totality sound okay. The other two really don't sound right. And in any case, there is no list like that in the ideal, where he lists those categories or something that could be represented. I mean, he brings up necessity, but now we've seen that the part where he starts talking about necessity, he's already gone beyond the ideal. What I think is going on, however, is this. The confusing thing, again, is that in this case, the object of the idea is the thing whose internal condition all the external conditions are supposed to add up to. Now, when you add up all the external conditions, that's totality. Right? That adding up a plurality together is totality. But now I'm saying add that all up, and it should be equal to the internal condition of something. So the object of the idea actually gets these categories again. In a sense, it's like it should get these categories, right? That is, if we just stopped with the idea and didn't make the dialectical inference that leads to the ideal, and just said, I'm thinking of the sum total of all possibility, then I would be thinking about totality, limitation, community, and necessity. But once I bring in the ideal, I'm bringing it into this spot, and so I need to think of it by its internal predicates. And there are lists like that. So one of them is on 493. This is at the top of B608. If, in following up this idea of ours, we proceed to hypothesize it, we shall be able to determine the primordial being through the mere concept of the highest reality, as a being that is one, simple, all-sufficient, eternal, etc. In short, we shall be able to determine it in its unconditioned completeness through all predicaments. Well, so I think one, it's simple, definitely we recognize from the paralogisms, right? They come back again. All sufficient probably refers to this. Eternal, I think in a, well, I think in a way eternal corresponds to absolute possibility. The reason being, I mean, it's similar to what we got in the case of rational psychology, that where the fourth paralogism was about the distinction between the soul and external things. Right? And in this case, when we say that God is eternal, we don't mean that there's always God all the time. We mean that God is not under the conditions of time. Right? So somehow, similarly, what we're saying here is that God is to be distinguished from all things, internal or external. And there's another list. This is in the note. It's the bottom of page 495, and it's B611. The ideal of the ens realissimum, although it is indeed a mere representation, is first realized, that is, made into an object, then hypostatized, I can never say that, and finally, by the natural progress of reason towards the completion of unity, is, as we shall presently show, personified. So, hypostatized definitely refers to substance. You know, I think part of the reason I have trouble saying this is I think maybe some people say hypostasized and some people say hypostatized.
Yeah.
It's maybe a British-American difference or something, I don't know. Anyway, hypostasis means substance. I mean, that is, a hypo means sub, and the stasis means stance. And this is true even though substance was originally a translation of a completely different Greek word. So this is Greek and Latin. That is, by saying hypostasized here, Kant is following one of his normal practices of substituting Greek terms for Latin ones. Right? Similar to the fact that he talks about the hyperphysical instead of the supernatural. Things like that. So it's substantialized, we could fill in here. And realized, right? Because real is quality. And personified, see, this may not be so obvious, but if you turn back to the paralogisms, you'll see that what Kant says makes up the personality of the soul is its numerical identity. And therefore, he classifies personality of the soul under the category of quantity. So I think, now, right, so here we have possibility. I think the order of the categories here is this. So there's only 3 in that list I just read, right? First realized, then hypothesized, then personified. But I think that's because just the step to ideal itself is this. The ideal is the concept of something that's unconditionally possible, from which all other possibilities are derived. Right? So everything else is possible because in some sense it's a limitation of the variety of alternatives that are consistent with the ideal. So the ideal is the concept of something that's absolutely possible. That, so to speak, is the first dialectical inference here. So the order is modality, quality, relation, quantity. Now, I mean, that's screwy. It's not the normal order. But in a way, I'm comforted to see that it's screwy. Why? Because in the paralogisms, remember, they were out of order. In the antinomies, they're in order. And now the question is, wait, was there something weird about the paralogisms? Only that one's out of order? But I think the answer is no. There's something weird about the antinomies that allows them to remain in order. Namely, the antinomies is still talking about the empirical world. So I don't know how to explain exactly why we get this order in this case. I mean, it's hard enough, despite the fact that Kant actually gives an explanation, to say why the order is the way it is in the paralogisms. But I think it makes sense to say that it's a different order. It's kind of turned inside out somehow. Modality, quality, relation, quantity. And when you plug that in, I think you can actually see, as he goes on to discuss the ideal in section 2, that he's following this order. So at the bottom of page 492, B607, he's just finished the discussion of how the ideal is supposed to be the ens realissimum as the absolutely possible being, basically. And then he says, and this comes as kind of a surprise, we cannot say that a primordial being consists of a number of derivative beings, for since the latter presuppose the former, they cannot themselves constitute it. The idea of the primordial being must therefore be thought as simple. So, this actually parallels a step that Descartes takes in the third meditation. First we say, oh, this is the idea of all reality. And then Descartes says, well, okay, but maybe it's got some of reality here and some of reality is there, and that's enough to explain everything. And he says, no, on the contrary, one of the things that makes up the perfection of this idea is its absolute simplicity. That's the step Kant is taking there. And of course, simplicity, this is the step where it's realized. Because as in the paralogisms, for reasons I tried to explain, simplicity turns up as the first moment of quality. And then the next paragraph says, even more of a surprise, consequently, the derivation of all other possibility from this primordial being cannot, strictly speaking, be regarded as a limitation of its supreme reality, and as it were, a division of it. For in that case, the primordial being would be treated as a mere aggregate of derivative beings. And this, as we have just shown, is impossible, although in our first rough statements we have used such language. On the contrary, the supreme reality must condition the possibility of all things as their ground, not as their sum. Right? So I think this is talking about the fact that at first we think, and the same thing happens in the third meditation, at first we think that the concept of the ens realissimum is just kind of like add up every perfection we know about and glom it all together and you get the concept of the most perfect being. Right? So if you could take all the predicates we know and sort them out into ones that assert a reality and the ones that don't, we could attribute all of the positive ones to the ens realissimum. But then as Descartes goes on to discuss that, I mean, look, on the face of it, that's ridiculous. Right? I mean, that would mean that God has the, biggest possible nose, and that, right? It's a question that comes up in the meditations because Descartes is saying, God must have an intellect that's like mine but infinitely greater. Well, why not faculty of being hungry that's like mine but infinitely greater? Right? So in reality, we don't want to attribute any empirical predicates to this being. And that's what Descartes goes on to say. He says, well, of course, all these predicates belong to him only in an equivocal or analogous sense, in the sense that he's the ground of them. So Kant is taking that same step here, and what it amounts to in this case is saying that the synthesis between God and the world is not mathematical but dynamical. It's between ground and consequent, not between sum and parts. And so it's like the relationship between substance and accident. Now, I don't think, although it's possible, I wonder if this is why he wants to make this stuff unclear. You could say, actually the conclusion of rational of transcendental theology is Spinozism. God is the substance. But I'm not sure if we're supposed to think that that's the conclusion. But anyway, God is like the substance, and the empirical world is like accidents, is the conclusion here. And then finally personified. So that step, as he says, he's going to talk about later. But, how we get from what Kant calls deism, which is, thinking of... No, actually, this is not what he calls deism. He thinks all of this makes... even the personified part is still deism. He says it's only becomes theism when we think of God and the moral attributes. But anyway, how we get to the idea of God as an intelligence, he doesn't really say here, except he does say in that footnote, now I'm going over even my going over, but I just want to read the end of that footnote as a punchline here. 495. For the regulative unity of experience is not based on the appearances themselves, on sensibility alone, but on the connection of the manifold through the understanding in an apperception. Right? So what he's saying is, in the case of the objects of experience, what is the unity of experience as a whole? It's based on the relation of the manifold back to the understanding as principle of unity. And consequently, the unity of the supreme reality and the complete determinability, possibility of all things, seems to lie in a supreme understanding and therefore in intelligence. Right? So the personification works by saying, and this being must be absolutely one, and therefore its relationship to the world is like that of an intelligence to the manifold that it knows. Which also finally explains how it's the category of modality that's really being used to understand the relationship between God and the world, in the same way that it was the subjective transcendentals that were used in the paralogism, and these categories that were used in the antiques. Okay, that's it. See you tomorrow night. Thank you for coming. Thanks.